Welcome to Sideline Sanity with me, Michelle Tafoya, sponsored by Legacy Precious Metals. There has never been a better time to invest in precious metals. Go to legacypminvestments.com, legacypminvestments.com. Find out how gold and silver might help you protect your wealth and retirement. That's so important right now. Freedom is super important. In America, it's what the Constitution is based on. Individual responsibility, taking advantage of the opportunities that come to you because you are free to do so. But when a leader of a nation or a state or a town or a school district or a federal agency says, you know what, we have an emergency and it's called a pandemic. And because we have an emergency, we have to suspend all of your normal freedoms and put some emergency procedures into place. And that means you and your children must get vaccinated or you can't leave your home. What about that freedom? And if that state of emergency is declared, how long is it going to be in place? I mean, really, how long is it going to be in place? Because it's still in place for a pandemic that the president of the United States said had ended. And yet they're still employing emergency powers and doing things in these agencies that we haven't elected them to do. So this is important stuff. Is this the new abnormal? This is a book, The New Abnormal, The Rise of the Biomedical Security State by Dr. Kheriaty, who was fired from his job for filing a lawsuit saying, you know what, you should not be able to mandate vaccines on the University of California campus. Well, as he's about to explain, things can go a little awry at work when you sue the company for which you work. He did it anyway. He was brave enough to do it anyway. And now he is the fellow and director of the Bioethics and American Democracy Program at Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's got courage, he's got guts, and he's got this book out. Dr. Kheriaty joins us next to talk about medical freedom.
For nearly 3 decades, she's reported the action from the sidelines. She started very young. She's covered the NBA, NFL, Olympics, and the college football and basketball national championships. And now, during these insane times in our world, Michelle Tafoya thinks we need a serious dose of sanity. This is Sideline Sanity with your host, one of the sanest people on planet Earth, Michelle Tafoya.
So you hear about the new normal. How about this? The new abnormal. This book, The Rise of the Biomedical Security State. You look at it and you go, okay, hold on a second. What does this all mean? The biomedical security state. Well, let's talk to the author, Dr. Kheriaty, who's joining us. And your story is remarkable. So I want to start with that first, and we'll get to the book because the book is so important. But you got fired.
That's right.
From your job.
That's right.
And what happened?
I tell the story in chapter 2, but the brief version is almost exactly a year ago, a little over a year ago, I filed a lawsuit in federal court challenging the University of California's vaccine mandate on grounds that it was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. I had spent my entire career as an academic physician at the University of California, 15 years. I was a full professor in the School of Medicine, and I also directed the medical ethics program at the hospital. I had been involved in all of the COVID policies from the beginning of the pandemic, developing those policies for the entire university system, not just the University of California, Irvine, the branch campus where I was at, but all of the UCs that had hospitals. And that was the case until the vaccine mandate came down from on high. And our group of critical care physicians and bioethicists who had been consulted on all the other pandemic policies was not consulted on that policy. And I had serious concerns about that policy, about the ethics of that policy. I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal just before the policy was finalized, arguing that vaccine mandates, the university vaccine mandates that we were starting to see roll out were unethical. They violated basic principles of medical ethics, including the principle of informed consent. that was articulated in the Nuremberg Code following the Second World War, that during this time of crisis, we were in a kind of panic throwing those foundational principles overboard. So when the university finalized its mandate, I started seeing people being harmed by it. I saw students that had moral or conscience-based objections getting steamrolled. They didn't necessarily consider themselves religious, and they didn't want to submit an insincere request for a religious exemption. It became almost impossible for reasons I describe in the book to get a medical exemption in the state of California because the board was threatening discipline of any physician who wrote a medical exemption, even one that was appropriate. So I thought,
I got to stop you.
I thought I got to do something about this.
Yeah, well, let me just stop you because I have a couple follow-ups here.
Yeah.
So you were part of the decision-making, or you at least consulted with the University of California. And again, for people who don't know, this is Berkeley, this is UCLA, this is UCF, This is UC Irvine, where you physically were. And then you said on high, they made this vaccine mandate. Was the Board of Regents, or was who at the University of California made this decision without consulting you?
Well, it came from the office of the president, which is where our work group was situated. So the president of the university, I imagine in consultation with the Board of Regents, they had to have known that this was going to be a controversial policy, which is all the more reason that they should have had more internal consultation. As people were getting steamrolled, I just decided to put a stake in the ground. I was trying to project ahead to the required ethics course that I taught every year to first and second year medical students. And I was trying to imagine myself talking about the principle of informed consent, talking about, moral courage and standing up and doing what's right for your patients, even when it, might cost you something. And I just couldn't imagine waking up with a clear conscience if I was in a position where I knew that this was wrong, and I had some standing to oppose it, you could say, because of my professional qualifications. So I decided to file the lawsuit. And if you want to go sideways with your employer very quickly, one good way to do that is to sue them in federal court. Michelle, just words to the wise. But I knew where things would go when I made that decision. So the university acted very quickly. On November 1st of last year, they placed me on unpaid suspension. And then a month later in December, they fired me. So that decision cost me my job, cost me my career in academic medicine, you could say. And this book is in part my attempt to understand what happened to us over the last 3 years and why so many irrational and authoritarian policies that didn't actually advance public health, nonetheless, were accepted, were embraced by our authorities, and were sort of passively embraced by so many people around the world. And what I discovered is that I had to go beyond public health to answer these questions. So the book digs into the bad public health policies and the reasons why they failed. But it also digs into wider questions about who benefited economically, who benefited politically, who gained by these measures. And also, I discovered that I had to go back about 20 years digging into some history of changes in public health. What I call the biomedical security state in the subtitle is a kind of welding of three different elements. The first is an increasingly militarized public health apparatus. And that's been in the works, as I said, for about 2 decades. That has now become welded to digital technologies of surveillance and control. Like a quick and easy way to understand this is to think about the vaccine passport system that was rolled out all over Europe and in many other jurisdictions worldwide. This idea that I had to show a QR code to get on a train, get on a plane, go to a restaurant, get back into my own country of origin. And this QR code was a signal that I had done what the public health authorities told me to do. And it could become a moving target, right? Unlike a real passport, which has a fixed expiration date. The expiration date on the vaccine passport could change on a whim, right? Now you've got a green pass, but next week you got to get your booster in order to, maintain your green pass. So these really weren't quote unquote passports. they were temporary licenses to live. And they required this new digital technology that started really around 2007 with the invention of the iPhone, required this to function. So this was the first pandemic of the sort of digital age. And we saw some of the consequences of that over the last 3 years. And so this militarized public health apparatus and the surveillance and control that digital technologies now allow for, all this was backed up by the police powers of the state. So those three elements are what I have termed the biomedical security state. And what I discovered, and what's very clear to me now, is that even though some of these irrational COVID policies, the lockdowns, the school closures, vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, the things that actually didn't succeed in stopping the spread of the virus, 90% of Americans still got COVID in spite of all of these things. That infrastructure is still in place, and it's waiting for the next declared public health crisis. So I also describe in the book that we've moved to a model of governance that sort of requires jumping from one emergency to the next in order to maintain emergency powers. And so I try to, in the book, I try to be forward looking and ask, where's this going next?
Yeah, it's really scary. And so let's just for a second go back to this militarized public health apparatus that you describe. Break that down for us. What do you mean by militarized?
So there's a section in the book called Wargaming Pandemics, where I describe that over the last 20 years, every couple of years, there have been a series of tabletop pandemic exercises run by the highest level national security officials, the highest level public health officials, the highest level sort of corporate executives of companies like pharma and so forth that would be involved in a pandemic response. And if you look at how these exercises go, the point of the exercise is always to show that whatever response the participants thought was necessary was not kind of authoritarian or draconian enough. All of the tabletop exercises end with a forced mass vaccination campaign. The sort of take-home lesson of all of these is we need more stringent measures of control in order to manage the pandemics of the future. So this has been percolating behind the scenes, and this biosecurity model has been developed really, again, over the last 20 years, but especially accelerated in the last 10 years. And it was rolled out during COVID and sort of became manifest, or became the experience of many people for the first time. But there is a history of this developing that I think it is really important for Americans to be aware of. The tight cooperation between the national security apparatus, the intelligence agencies, CIA, NSA, and the public health agencies can account for a lot of what we saw during COVID. And one simple way to kind of wrap your head around this is to realize that the Department of Health and Human Services that houses the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, this looked like sort of the front man. These looked like the public health officials who were calling the shots during the pandemic. But we now know that it was actually the Department of Homeland Security that was calling the shots in terms of pandemic
calling
policies.
Which shots in all the
Making
shots,
decisions,
like
for example, the initial fatal decision was to lock down. Lockdowns have never been a part of conventional public health. They were not part of our pandemic plan, our published and acknowledged pandemic plans prior to the pandemic. Even at the WHO, which has now embraced lockdowns, their pandemic plans did not embrace lockdowns until COVID. The origins of lockdowns, people forget. The first region to lock down was Wuhan, China. And the Chinese Communist Party announced to the world that they had stamped out the virus through this extremely authoritarian, top-down command and control measure. That was, of course, a lie.
But they didn't stamp it out. It was a lie, right? They didn't stamp it out.
CCP
and in
propaganda.
fact, so are you saying that, and we bought it as the rest of the world.
So Italy
we took our cues from that.
That's right. Italy was the next country to lock down. And Michael Sanger and others have traced the lines of connection between Italy's key public health officials and the Chinese Communist Party. Once Italy locked down, we looked at what was happening in Italy and said, we have to do the same. So Dr. Fauci and Birx and the White House Coronavirus Task Force decided lockdowns were the way to go in February. The New York Times got on board and published an article the next day saying, basically arguing that to get a handle on this virus, people's civil rights are going to have to be suspended, and we just need to accept that. Once the United States locked down, the rest of the world sort of followed and fell, you could say, like dominoes. So that was the initial fatal mistake. We looked to an authoritarian regime to guide us in terms of how to manage this pandemic. And even after it became abundantly clear that the lockdowns were doing far more harm than good, we stuck to them and said, no, the only way that we're going to get back to a normal life is through coerced vaccination. And until everyone gets the vaccine, we're not going to loosen up the lockdown measures. And of course, that became a moving target because we got vaccines that were leaky, that did not stop infection and transmission. And so we saw the authoritarian lockdowns and school closures, which did incalculable harms to an entire generation of young people especially, roll into an authoritarian regime in 2021 where people like me lost our jobs because we stood up for the right of informed consent and the right to make medical decisions about, what interventions we were going to accept. And I think we're still living with the consequences of that biosecurity sort of approach to the COVID pandemic. And in a sense, what we've seen so far, I worry, is only just the beginning. So I talk in The New Abnormal about the next steps that are now being introduced. If you start reading the headlines and you start paying attention, the idea, for example, of biometric forms of identification that are tied to digital IDs that are tied to biometric data, like your iris scan, your face ID, your fingerprint. That is going to be tied into your medical record information. Eventually, wearables and implantable devices will be gathering biometric data literally from under your skin. This is not dystopian science fiction. These are technologies that are already available. They just haven't been rolled out on a mass scale.
Yeah. I mean, you can see it coming if you're willing to open your eyes and look. Let me ask you a couple more questions before we move to what's next about what happened. So you're saying in this sort of war gaming planning every couple of years over the last couple of decades for this pandemic, this forward-looking, okay, what are we going to do as big pharma, as security, as the NIH or the CDC, whatever? Let's game plan. Lockdowns were never part of those game plans, and they only became introduced after China did it?
So lockdowns were never a part of officially published pandemic planning. So the CDC...
They could have been unofficial.
That's right. So these wargaming exercises occurred, I would say, under the radar, not necessarily behind the scenes. And I say that because a lot of them are still available online. The one that's received the most attention is Event 201, which occurred, we now know, just as the first COVID cases were actually circulating in China, but before any cases had been publicly announced. So literally a few weeks before the emergence of the pandemic into public consciousness, you had this tabletop exercise sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, and other stakeholders that included people like Avril Haines, who was then appointed head of national security in the United States, overseeing all of our national security agencies. You had a former director of the CDC. You had the director of the Chinese equivalent of the CDC participating in this. You had the executives from big pharma like Johnson & Johnson participating. So these were high-level people, many of whom, like a month after this tabletop exercise, moved into positions where they were actually making pandemic-related decisions in the public sector. And Event 201 was a fictional scripted scenario about a worldwide coronavirus outbreak, which is enough to turn anyone into a kind of tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. But go on YouTube, watch the 12-minute highlight version of Event 201, or watch the entire 4-part exercise. And it's rather jaw-dropping. And the conclusion there is that actually China does pretty well, but the Western nations are too concerned about, freedom and their civil liberties, so they don't do so well. And the takeaway from that is that we need to control the flow of information through censorship and internet shutdowns. We need to engage in lockdown type measures. So the idea of lockdowns is there in these tabletop exercises, even if it hasn't been officially embraced in, what the WHO or the CDC might be publishing on their website in terms of how to manage, let's say, an influenza pandemic prior to COVID. So COVID was the opportunity to sort of mainstream this and officially embrace it on the part of public health and governmental authorities.
One country that didn't lock down was Sweden.
Yeah.
And they had far different results. No one paid attention to that, or if they did, they called it a one-off or said it wasn't representative. Why was that ignored?
So Sweden was the control group for the lockdowns. A control group is the placebo arm of an experiment where you don't do the intervention and you compare. That's what I mean by the control group. And people viciously attacked Sweden when they decided not to lock down because the other public health authorities did not want a control group. So the lockdowns were premised on a model from the Imperial College of London. Niall Ferguson's group predicted millions of deaths in the United States within a couple of months if we didn't lock down. His group predicted 60,000 deaths in Sweden if they didn't lock down. Sweden didn't lock down, and instead of getting 60,000 deaths, they got 6,000 deaths. So that model over-predicted mortality by a factor of 10 in that small country and by a much larger factor in bigger countries. So it was a massively failed predictive model, which we should have known because this same group had published massively exaggerated predictive models for previous pandemics like swine flu, H1N1, bird flu. They had a record of alarmist failure. And yet that's the model that we looked to. That's the model that our public health authorities in this country cited as the reason that we need to go into lockdowns. And they should have known better because the track record of this group, which again, not to sound too conspiratorial, but Imperial College London has very strong ties to Xi Jinping's regime. Basically, there's a strong connection between the research going on at Imperial College and Chinese public health, specifically in the area of public health, Chinese researchers. So we see the influence of China on much of our pandemic response in supposedly Western democratic nations, and that was a significant part of the reason why our response became both so authoritarian and so compromised in terms of the harms done.
Ugh. All right, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty is our guest. Quick break, and we'll come back and look ahead a little bit, and also ask some questions about the human condition and why people felt like, well, I'm doing the right thing. It's not going to hurt me. I'm going to go ahead and obey because I don't want to be responsible for anyone else dying, yada, yada, yada. We'll get into that right after this with Aaron Kheriaty. Well, talking about the new normal or the new abnormal, as it were, this inflation stuff, it wasn't quite as transitory as they tried to convince us it was it? I mean, we all feel it. None of us like it. We are so uncomfortable with gas prices, grocery prices, all the rest. And that's the short-term stuff. Now, what about the long-term plays? Have you looked at your investments? How's the stock market reacting? What's everything doing to your retirement, your wealth, the stuff you've built up for the long term, for your golden years? Golden years. Gold maybe should be involved in your golden years. And the only people I trust for investing in gold and silver are legacy precious metals. Now, we're experiencing a little bit like 2008 when those who invested in gold saw really nice gains and others simply lost their retirements. So why not investigate in this idea of gold and silver in your 401k, your IRA? Call Legacy Precious Metals. These people are great. They're going to spend their time talking to you, educating you, figuring out if this is right for you. This is not a hard sell. This is an investigative phone call on your part, 866-528-1903. Again, 866-528-1903, or download their free investor's guide at legacypminvestments.com. They support this show. We support them, and they're ready to support you in any decision that you might make regarding gold and silver in your retirement portfolio. Give them a call. Just get your questions answered. 866-528-1903 or legacypminvestments.com. So, Dr. Kheriaty, you lost your career at UC Irvine at the University of California. I would imagine your reputation took a hit. Why were so few in the medical community like you willing to stand up and speak out?
I think one of the reasons is that we have a very centralized system controlling the funding for scientific research to start with. So at major universities that do biomedical research, most of their research dollars come from the NIH. The NIH gives over $500 million to about a dozen universities in the United States to do biomedical research. So federal funding is the key to everything that happens in medical research. It's your key to career advancement. You have to get certain types of NIH grants to advance as a medical researcher. And the universities cannot operate without those federal dollars. And we have a small group of people, a small kind of cabal that controls the purse strings at the NIH. So when you have a person with as much power, not just over public opinion because he's on the news all the time, but actually over research funding, as Anthony Fauci has, or Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, you're going to be very reluctant to speak out against their preferred pandemic policies. Or if you try to, your university might actually come down on you and say, don't say anything that would compromise our university's position vis-a-vis the NIH, because that's where the money comes from. So that's a big problem. We need a more decentralized system of federal funding.
Yeah, that's an extremely powerful position that
Absolutely.
Fauci and the NIH have.
Too powerful.
I mean, because now you're saying it does seem to, how do you recommend that changes? Like, why are so few responsible for deciding about where this massive amount of money gets spent, how it gets spent? And what's the likelihood of that changing?
So we'll see what the political will is for reform of our HHS agencies like NIH, CDC, FDA. These are agencies that are very seriously compromised. Some of them are captured by corporate interests. Others are compromised just by the systemic corruption that occurs when you have someone like Anthony Fauci in place for 34 years. You just amass massive power and become untouchable and can literally destroy people's careers if they disagree with you, destroy credible scientists' careers, like Nobel Prize winning scientist level people, if they cross you. So we need term limits on directorships. Certainly, we can't have someone like that staying in that position of enormous power and authority for 30 plus years. But we also, I think, need a more decentralized system. So one of the proposals in the last chapter of my book is block grants to states for funding of biomedical research. So rather than having one at NIH, we have 50 state departments or state institutes of health that fund research in their states. And they can partner with one another on larger projects. They can compete with one another to try to attract, good researchers to their state or to their institutes or to the state universities. So that, if you have a different view than the leadership at the NIH, you can voice it and, move to another state if the funding dries up, where, go to another university if the funding dries up, where you happen to reside. So, that's one proposal, and there's many other ways you could work to decentralize the system. And, wiser minds than I have come up with interesting policy proposals. So the question isn't whether you can reform these agencies. You can. It will be very difficult. The question is whether we're going to have the political will and whether the American people are going to see the need for and demand reform of the whole sort of biomedical and public health enterprise in the United States. I think it's an absolutely crucial thing to do for the health and welfare of the American people. But I think there's still a lot of folks out there that just aren't aware of how bad the pandemic response was. The control of information has been very effective at convincing people that we had good outcomes when in fact we had disastrous outcomes.
Things were said that maybe were wrong, and a lot of voices were just shut down.
That's right.
And look, I'm not a voice in the medical field, but I can tell you that I went onto Facebook and posted an article by a physician who was talking about a particular treatment, and the backlash was ridiculous. Yeah. I was posting somebody else's findings or anecdotal evidence or whatever, and I was spoken to by all of these people. A, like I was wearing a tinfoil hat. B, like I was stupid. Yeah. C, like I was some sort of, you got called every name in the book, and it had a chilling effect. We all know that.
Yeah, that's right.
If you don't know that, you haven't been paying attention. So, and I think trust in the media plummeted for these reasons. Yeah. But has it plummeted enough for people to find other ways? How do we do it? There's no media outlet that anyone feels really good about trusting as there used to be.
Well, we now know that our federal government spent $1 billion on advertising of the vaccines. And so they were heavily invested in the success of those products and the failure of any other early treatments. We also know, and we have considerable evidence, that the federal government has been colluding with social media companies to suppress and censor free speech around pandemic issues and potentially around other issues as well. So our listeners may have heard about a recent lawsuit in Missouri v. Biden, where the state attorney general of Missouri and Louisiana filed suit alleging that the high-level officials in the Biden administration have been doing what I just described, basically leaning on social media companies to do their bidding. And arguably, I say arguably because there's a lot of legal debate about this, but arguably private companies like Facebook and Twitter can decide who they take off their platform and can censor people according to community guidelines. But inarguably, the federal government cannot do that. That's a clear violation of the First Amendment free speech rights of Americans. And the federal government cannot suborn or commandeer these private companies to do its bidding. And so there's 4 private plaintiffs also in that lawsuit. I'm one of them. 2 of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration are also plaintiffs in that suit. And so far, the documents we've received on discovery show not only that this was in fact happening, but it was happening on a much broader scale than even we suspected. There's like 22 federal agencies that were involved in dictating to social media companies, down to the level of, an email that says, why hasn't this specific person, so-and-so, been taken off your platform? And then, Twitter or Facebook writes back 10 minutes later, oh, don't worry, we're taking care of that. He's gone, right? So down into the weeds at that level of specificity, the federal government has been censoring and violating free speech rights. The latest development in that case, which I'm happy to report, is that the judge approved our request to depose 7 key officials, including Anthony Fauci. So this will be the first time that Fauci will have to answer really difficult pointed questions rather than just softballs from his media friends, but difficult questions under oath with the penalty of perjury, and without the ability to just give evasive answers. The court will not accept non-answers to questions pertinent to what we're alleging in the case. So, I'm hoping that we can start pushing back against the biomedical security regime's censorship arm. But on the other hand, it's also concerning that, it takes the private action of citizens and individuals. And in this case, we have help from two state AGs. But many of these lawsuits pushing back against the biomedical security regime are filed on behalf of citizens and maybe paid for out of their own pockets or by nonprofits. When we're in a situation in which we have to fight a federal government that has unlimited resources with the very limited resources of private citizens, it's not a good sign for the future of the Democratic Republic.
No, it's not. It's a little bit terrifying, frankly, but the fact is you do have this opportunity. Let me get to some of the nuts and bolts about that lawsuit and this ability to depose Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Yeah.
Will this be kind of a closed door, kind of, like you said, he can't give evasive answers? It's
It's a case in federal court, which means all of the documents will be public, including the deposition information. So,
there won't be like a camera that Fauci's going to play to and try to.
No, the deposition itself.
I want that seems to me to be a good idea to not have a camera that he can play to.
Well, there will not be a camera for him to play to. It will be filmed for the purpose of transcribing it, and the transcribed document will be something that we're able to access. So, Americans will have access to the information gleaned during the so-called discovery process, which is where the court, allows us to subpoena documents, where the court allows us to do depositions, which is a questioning by our lawyers of the defendants under oath. And then in the trial phase as well, where, we're making arguments and questioning witnesses and defendants and so forth in court, that information will also be public. As with other court cases, they're probably not going to let the cameras into the room, but any of the information on the ruling, any of the information on what's being submitted as evidence will be publicly available. Is there a timeline for this? I think people will be dying to read this transcript of Dr. Fauci. Yeah, I don't know the timeline exactly on the depositions. I haven't heard from the lawyers on exactly when those are going to be done, but I imagine we'll get going on those certainly before the end of the calendar year. So likely very soon.
Okay. I want a quick question for people just to wrap this notion up of what people actually sacrificed by just saying, okay, give me the jab, give me another jab, give me another jab. I'll take the passport. I'll tell you something. I had my record of I stopped after 3 shots and I'm done. And I did it because I felt I had no choice if I wanted to function in the world. Actually, I didn't have a choice. I was working on the NFL at the time, and it was mandated by the league that if you were going to cover the NFL, you had to be vaccinated. So in order to keep my job, I had to be vaccinated. So I did. But I remember going to New York, Dr. Kheriaty, and going out to lunch with a friend, and you had to present your card of your vaccines, right? I refused to sign up for the app where there was just a little barcode. I wasn't going to do it. And I couldn't believe people were. People were, here's my code. Scan. I was thinking to myself, what do you realize what you're giving up here? Can you tell people in sort of a 101 kind of lesson what they're doing when they succumb to all of this and what it might mean for their futures?
You're taking things that should be inalienable rights and you're turning them into privileges conferred by the government. And when you do that, you don't get those things back, or you only get those things back for when you submit a good behavior report. So that's a road to increased surveillance on your privacy. That's a road to increased and increasingly subtle measures of control over your behavior, including your healthcare decisions. I quote at the end of the book Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Soviet dissident who exposed the horrors of the gulags and of Stalin's regime.
Yes.
In his books, Nobel Prize winner in literature. And Solzhenitsyn has a quote in his book, The Gulag Archipelago, where he says, basically, why didn't we stand up? Why did we just sort of go along with what was being rolled out? Why didn't we push back against it when there were still opportunities to resist it? And he said, his answer was, we didn't love freedom enough. He says, we hurried to submit. We submitted with pleasure. And then the kicker, the kind of brutal truth line, he says, we purely and simply deserved everything that came afterwards. And this was a man who was unjustly imprisoned in the Gulag for years. I mean, he firsthand experienced the horrors of the regime. And he said, well, the Soviet people got kind of this indictment that we got what we deserve because we didn't love our freedoms enough. And we submitted to this totalitarian regime with pleasure. So I think a lot of what we sort of take for granted in terms of freedom of movement and freedom of association and freedom of speech, we don't realize how fragile those things are. That's not just going to continue automatically. There are moneyed interests, there are interests of people with power that push back against those things all the time. And so it's important on an ongoing basis in every new generation. And it sounds like a cliche, we have to fight for our freedoms as Americans. But it's become a cliche because it's true, actually. And
because it's true. Absolutely.
It's always in a crisis. It's always in a quote unquote emergency that we're in greatest danger of relinquishing those freedoms and then never getting them back. Yep. And there's historical precedent for this. Anytime you draw a historical analogy to the Third Reich, people freak out, and probably rightly so. You're just comparing us to the Nazis. So no, I'm not comparing the current or the previous administration to the Nazi regime, but it remains an undeniable historical fact that the Nazis governed for virtually the entirety of their time in power for 12 years under Article 38 of the Weimar Constitution, which permitted the suspension of German laws during times of emergency. And in that case, the emergency lasted 12 years. So people forget that Hitler was democratically elected Chancellor of Germany. How did he go from a democratically elected chancellor of a supposedly free society to a totalitarian dictator? Well, the answer to that question is complex, but a big part of it was this declared state of emergency, the assumption of additional powers under the declared state of emergency, and then the unwillingness to relinquish those powers. And we're still operating at a federal level under a state of emergency, where President Biden gains 128 additional extra constitutional powers he wouldn't otherwise have. So when he announced that the pandemic is over about a month ago on 60 Minutes, which it was actually true. It's been over for a while and was probably good for, the midterm kind of we're doing okay campaign. Nonetheless, his advisors sort of panicked and said, no, you can't say that. Well, why did they panic? Well, if that's true, then the federal emergency has to end, and he has to relinquish those powers. And unelected federal bureaucrats and HHS folks have to relinquish their emergency powers. And the emergency use authorization issued for the vaccines will disappear if there's no longer an emergency. So this issue of the state of emergency I talk about in the book as well. It's kind of a background legal issue that a lot of Americans are not aware of, but it's kind of the foundational mechanism that allowed all these other problematic policies that I talked about to proceed basically unopposed.
Yep. I'm so glad we got to that point. That is crucial. When you consider these unelected people having power over the population of a country because we're in an emergency that we're not really in, and all the ramifications, it's terrifying. I want two personal questions before I let you go, Doctor. I was looking at your book and I read the dedication, which I want to read to people because I am curious about it. For my wife, Jennifer, who long ago perceived the dangers brewing, you resisted the new normal, quote unquote, and you gave me courage to oppose it. What did she see that sort of that you're talking about?
So she was very suspicious of the forced vaccination campaign. She was aware of the possibility of vaccine injuries, which happen. You can argue about how common or rare they are, but they happen, and she knows that at a personal level through close friends who have children and others who have been harmed by vaccines. So she was very keen on. We need to be very careful when informed consent is compromised. Parents need to be able to make healthcare decisions for their children, and competent adults need to be able to make healthcare decisions for themselves. She also started seeing the mental health harms. She's not a psychiatrist like I am, and I saw them clinically, but she was seeing them just in our social circle. We lost a very dear friend, a 17-year-old kid in December of 2020 that I've known literally since he was born. He was best friends with my, at that time, 17-year-old son, all throughout their childhood, were very close with his parents. And after prolonged school closures and struggling from depression with the effects of everything that we had been through, he took his life that month, which was the worst thing that happened. Many bad things happened to me during the pandemic, but his death was by far the worst. So Jennifer's the real hero of the story. You should be having her on the show and not me. We're high school sweethearts. We go back a long ways, and she's raised 5 amazing sons. And I couldn't do anything that I've done without her help and support. And when I was wavering she never told me what to do about the lawsuit or about getting the vaccine. She always respected my decision on that. But when I was wavering, when it became clear that either I give in or they're going to fire me, she didn't tell me what to do, but she sort of said, I think you know what to do. I think you know what you need to do. I think you need to finish what you started and follow through on it. I think people will need to look to you, as an example of not giving in. And she was absolutely right. And that was the right thing to do. Yeah. And she gave me the nudge that I needed to do the right thing in the right moment. So, I could keep going. We're probably going to run out of time, but I could continue singing Jennifer's praises. It's lovely dedication. And I love hearing, wow, 5 boys. That's an amazing thing too. And you obviously have landed on your feet. You have so many titles that I was joking with you off camera that we'll just call you the king of biomedical ethics, but you've landed on your feet. Do you feel as though you've landed on your feet, that you are a success story in this? Certainly
standing up.
Certain doors closed to me, but God opened other doors. And so far, I've landed on my feet. I mean, my head is still spinning, honestly. I published the book a year to the day after I had been placed on unpaid suspension. And those 12 months have been an absolute blur. And I've met many wonderful new people. I've done many wonderful new things. Financially, I'm okay this year. I don't know what next year is going to look like. We'll see. But I'm confident enough that, by doing the right thing, our family has been taken care of. And I trust that, I'll find my way in the future down the road. New opportunities are coming down the pike. And so I have no regrets about what I did. It was scary at the time. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know where I was going to get health insurance for my family come January. So I had to scramble to put things together and try to open up a private practice so I could continue seeing my patients. But many wonderful people have reached out with support. Some of them, financially supporting my work at the Ethics and Public Policy Center or at the Zephyr Institute, these independent think tanks that took me in and gave me a home to do my research and my public health and public policy work. So it's been a wild ride, but so far I'm enjoying it. And Jennifer has been a good sport about the whole thing. So it's been an adventure.
Oh, well, listen, I applaud your courage.
Thank you.
I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for your knowledge. I think a lot of people, when all the tales are written, this move that you made, this stance that you took will be, I hope, seen for what it is and put out there as an example. The book, again, The New Abnormal, The Rise of the Biomedical Security State. This is important stuff. I don't know if there's anything more important than our health. And it goes beyond just, it goes beyond just how, your visits to the doctor. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been Sideline Sanity. Be brave like Aaron Kheriaty's been brave. Do good like he has. And we'll see you next time. Happy to talk once again with Charles Thorngren, the CEO of Legacy Precious Metals. I think it still is confusing to people, some people, as to why a precious metals investment would be a worthwhile one, particularly at this time when they're thinking, I'm doing all I can to put gas in the car. Why is now a particularly good time? And we'll go from there to how small of an investment is worthwhile for someone.
A great question. And I think the importance of why really comes into the fact that we have to save for ourselves, whether it's a little here, a little there, whether it's making it a plan and putting out so much a paycheck, whether it's making sure we fund our retirement account. We have to realize we are responsible for ourselves in the long run.
You mean that no one else is going to ride up and save us, on some white steed?
It ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. And anyone who's promising to do that is getting ready to take advantage of you in some form or fashion.
Yeah. And so if I'm an investor, a potential investor, and I'm looking at Legacy Precious Metals and I'm saying to myself, this sounds smart. I don't have a lot to spend. What would you tell that person?
I would say, do what you can. If you never start, you never get there. So the most important step you can take is saying, I'm going to take care of myself and my family. I'm going to make it a plan. I'm going to take action. I'm going to start in the way that's comfortable for me. That's the important thing. The first step is always the hardest. But once you take that first step, the second step is easier. And then you're moving. And then once you're in motion, it's hard to stop you. So that first step, most important step.
I always tell people they can call and talk to an IRA expert or check out the guide that they can download for free, the Investor's Guide. What is the number one question that you get from people who are first-time investors?
The biggest question I get is this right for me? That is the question.
And that comes from everyone. So everyone's asking the same, is this right for me? And yet we're all so unique. And yet it is a sound investment for just about any portfolio, isn't it?
It is. Even though we're all unique, that uniqueness is going to tailor the way we begin the investment. Okay. But we're all in the same situation. That's the one thing I think we seem to forget in today's society. Whether you agree with somebody or not, we're in this together. America is in this transition that we're in right now. We're dealing with the same issues. Some people like them, some don't. But we're all in it together, right? So the need is the same. How we prepare and how we invest is what changes from person to person. But we all have that same need.
It's a great point. And again, I encourage people to just make the call, pick up the phone. That step is always the hardest. I'm not sure why that is. In any kind of effort that you make in life, whether it's weight loss or exercise or investing some way to better your life, it always seems like that first hurdle is the challenge. But when they call, who are they going to talk to? What's going to be on the other end of the line for them?
Great question. You're going to speak with one of our customer representatives, and their job is not to sell you metals, right? We have a much different approach. We're going to answer all your questions. We're going to show you what options you have. And on the rare occasion, this isn't right for you, we're going to say, this probably isn't right for you. We have a gold company here, but I say it all the time. What we actually deal in is customer service. We want each and every individual that calls to get the answers they need, to be able to make the decision that's right for them. And we want to do that in a way that's not pushy, that's not salesy. And that's what makes my team so special. We care about each and every caller. And we're going to show you what options you have, and then you get to make an informed decision. So don't be afraid of the phone call. It's the best thing you can do.
And this is why I am so honored and I feel privileged to be sponsored by Legacy Precious Metals. They're the ones that I'm going to deal with, and I encourage you to pick up the phone, give them a call. Even easier, go check out their guide. It's a free investor's guide at legacypminvestments.com, legacypminvestments.com. But as you said, Charles, pick up the phone. You're going to talk to someone who can answer your specific questions and get the ball rolling. Get started. Do something that is a long-term play for your family's benefit. Charles, it's always great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's always great to be here.